Right over here, we've got Mr. John Coleman, and he is from Belfry, Kentucky, on the border of West Virginia, and the home of the Hatfield and McCoy feud. And he attended Pikeville College and graduated in 2005, and began his PhD studies in British history at the University of Kentucky, where he was named the James Still Fellow. And his work looks at same-sex prostitution in Great Britain from 1885 to 1957. And as a British historian, he has studied and worked in archives all across Europe and the U.S., and now he's extensively involved with the Mary Todd Lincoln House, the childhood home of Abraham Lincoln's wife, a fascination that he says takes up a great deal of his time. And he said he lives in the home of Mary Lincoln's Confederate sister, Emily Todd Helm, and currently he teaches in the Women and Gender Studies Department at the University of Kentucky. And our friend Silas House recommended that we have John come speak tonight, and he said to tell everyone that he wished he could be with us. And he recommended John as someone who is really deeply rooted in his mountain heritage and as a really articulate, intelligent ambassador for the region and for all us country queers. So please welcome John Coleman.
I guess the question, right, the sort of premise of why we're here as fabulations, which I think I can adopt as in terms of nouns, but I have trouble with the adjective. I grade midterms Saturday night. I don't know if that's exactly being fabulous or not, but I do certainly identify with it as a noun. So what was it like to grow up gay in Appalachia? As they mentioned, I'm from Belfry, Kentucky, which is right on the border of West Virginia and Kentucky. In some ways, it's almost the epitome of Appalachianness, especially if you take it from sort of the hillbilly as being a byproduct of the Hatfield and McCoy feud, which of course there's certainly more to it than just that feud, but that is often, right, the mythic story of Appalachia. This has, of course, come back to haunt me through all of my pursuits in history. In fact, when the History Channel just produced their infamous, I would say here at Berea, miniseries this past summer, I was actually asked, right, here's a historian, he's from Appalachia, he knows all about the Hatfield McCoy feud. I didn't. But anyway, so asked, you know, spend some time with us and tell us about the feud. Let us hear your story. Let us hear the way you speak. The way I spoke was very important to these people. So I was a bit starstruck. Bill Paxton, the guy who played the main McCoy, was going to be there. The producers, I thought this would be my my entrance into getting on Ancient Aliens, which is one of my favorite television shows right now. The leaps in logic are beautiful. But anyway, so I went and I actually spent a day with this company before parting ways. And it became very clear to me in ways, my Appalachianness became very clear to me in ways that it hadn't been before. They were all, not to stereotype, but they were all Californians. No one was local. And they certainly had an understanding, right, of what they were going to see in their 24 hours in eastern Kentucky. And one of the first things they said to me, it was not Bill Paxton, it was one of the producers. Bill Paxton was actually a very nice guy. It was like, oh, your voice. I like my voice. He said, you've been educated out of your accent. And at that moment I was like, okay, this will be the extent of my experience with the Hatfield and McCoy feud on the History Channel. But it was this day, right, of where is the violence of Appalachia, where is the bloodshed of Appalachia, where is the backwardsness, and of course an education sort of removes one of your Appalachianness, right? The fact that my accent wasn't as strong as what they expected was, in their words, a disappointment, right? And so adding that, right, to this idea of Appalachian difference, this idea of sexual difference, right, to be gay growing up in Appalachia, it's a complicated question, but not exactly not exactly, I don't want to say that I disagree with, but that I find needs to be unpacked in certain ways, right? I don't really know what it means to have grown up gay in Appalachia, right? I just sort of grew up there. I grew up as John. And so trying to find the ways that my sexuality and my identity with place, where they meet, is a difficult thing to do. You know, it takes a lot of sort of intellectual work, a lot of intellectual labor to find those places. And so that's actually why I brought this paper from my Introduction to Feminist Theory course way back in the early part of my graduate career, because I can see now, looking 5 years later, that I'm trying to achieve this in this paper, where I actually write about what does it mean in terms of difference, looking at both Appalachianness and looking at sexuality, at homosexuality in particular. And I realize that I come over some similarities, that I see similarities in terms of the stereotypes of the two. One especially being the sense of immorality that surrounds both, right, in negative ways, particularly even sexual immorality, right? Appalachians as child molesters, right, child brides, incestuous, gay people as particularly sexually immoral, Fire Island and the Pines, and all these great parties in the 70s, and sort of going on more in terms of the similarities, right, that I was starting to see in the way people perceive, in negative ways, Appalachianness and homosexuality. But I think perhaps since then, maybe I have in some ways sort of realized, especially now that I live outside of Appalachia in some ways, living in Lexington, and that's an interesting place to be a hillbilly, because you're outside of Appalachia enough to notice it, but yet you're not far away enough for people not to be sensitive to it, right? Lexingtonians are too close to Appalachia to be comfortable with it in some ways. And so I really do. I guess that's sort of the main point I'm trying to make. I still don't really know what it means to be a gay Appalachian for myself, right? Were there instances in my sort of sexual history or in my place history where the two sort of combine and explode in some sort of ways? Maybe. But at the same time, I don't know, right? Because they're both sort of just there. I mean, not in any sort of essentialized way, but in the way that it's just how I've always viewed myself in certain ways. So when coming out to my parents, Lou and I were just sort of talking about this to give my own sort of, I guess, sexual history or whatever. Actually had a lot to do with leaving Appalachia. And that was going to London as a British historian. So it was my sophomore year of college, and before then I wouldn't have really considered myself to have been gay. If my parents were here, they would tell you he went to London and he came back gay. And maybe that's true. British men are quite attractive to me in certain ways. But I'm glad I see some support in the audience. But it was, right? It was this experience perhaps of seeing openly gay couples, of seeing men holding hands walking down the street, to sort of, open my eyes to a different way of seeing. Not necessarily a better way of seeing, though, either. I don't know if any of you caught the editorial in the New York Times that came out a few weeks ago called We're Here, We're Queer, Y'all. Very, very interesting. One of the statistics, and she doesn't cite it, so I don't know if it's true or not, is that you're more likely to be abused physically because of your sexual or gender identity in an urban space than in a rural space. And which, of course, to us seems contradictory, right? Or in terms of, that's what she's trying to show, that it appears that is contradictory, when in reality it may not be. And so this idea, right, that I leave Appalachia, I go off to London, and as far as my family is concerned, I come back gay, sort of rebuilds the story, right, of what it means, can queerness exist in Appalachia? Well, to my family, no. He went out and he called it while he was in Great Britain, right, came back with it, that it's an outsider brought back in, even though, that's not true at all. And so there's a lot of, was that a time signal or something? Am I close? Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I will need one because I spend a lot of my time lecturing, and so I can go 50 minutes without stopping, not a problem. And I certainly don't want to do that. So the idea of, where was I? Of leaving and coming back with this gayness and sort of attaching that, right, to the fact that I'm Appalachian. Did it make things harder? Did it make things different? I really can't answer it. But yet I can say that it wasn't that product of leaving, right? I can say that queerness did exist there before London, right? That it existed outside of this urban environment that we're so used to placing gayness in, right? Going to the cities to be gay, that narrative of having to leave the country that authors like Mary Gray has talked about in her book Out in the Country, for example. And that certainly did exist. In fact, one of the closest, I guess, queer communities that I have ever found was actually back home. And I found it through a church. My father is a pastor, so I come from a very religious household. And right after college, I actually taught at a private Christian school. Well, me and the woman that I had bus duty with became good friends. I was invited to a party at her house, and then right in the middle of it, she shouted, "If you're straight, raise your hand." And then I realized not a person in that house had raised their hand. I hadn't even realized that my friend at the Christian school was gay herself. And so, right, that shouldn't exist in Appalachia. That shouldn't be there, right, in this sort of urban narrative. But it did, right? And I was having, we had a great time there. It wasn't a bar, it wasn't a coffee shop, it wasn't, a gay bookstore or anything like that. It was just an apartment of a teacher at a Christian school. But that became a queer space, that became the gay community, and a very strong one, and one that helped me through a lot of things, particularly in that coming out period. In some ways, I think it may have been more difficult to be a gay person in Lexington than it ever was back home. Because in Lexington, there is, I think, in that sort of city environment where there are things like gay clubs and gay groups and a gay mayor and an equal protection ordinance, all of which are great things, right? But yet, all of which are things that seem to require one to be out in certain ways. While back home, that's, in many ways, it's just not. They don't expect straight people to talk about their sex lives, and so, in many ways, there are ways for me to pass there that I can't do outside of Appalachia. So, mostly I know I have gone on way too long and just blabbered for the most part. But that's sort of my experience, right? As you can see, it's hard for me to sort of put the two together because in many ways I am gay and I am Appalachian, but there are lots of other things going on in my life. I came from a certain social class. I came from a certain race within Appalachia. I came from a certain religious system that was very popular there, so it was easy to get along that way, to find privilege through my father's position in the church. So yeah, it's all kinds of things, right, that make us who we are. And that's really part of the best parts of us. So that's really all I have to say. Sorry I wasn't more. Silas House, I think, built me up a little too much as what, an articulate something. That was